Democracy, its meaning, development, and varieties. Introduction. In this session, you will be exposed to a major concept in political ideas, namely democracy. This study session is divided into 4 sections. Section 1 discusses the meaning of democracy, while Section 2 traces the historical development of democracy. The third section looks at types of democracy, and we conclude our discussion of democracy in the 4th section by looking at principles of democracy. When you have studied this session, you should be able to define democracy as a method of government, explain the development of democracy, and identify and explain 2 types of democracy. Democracy as a system of government can be related to participation in the affairs of government, either directly by the people or via elected representatives. As a body of ideas, democracy is considered as the basic idea that political power arises from the people. Democracy is a very controversial term. C.B. Macpherson points out that the word democracy has changed its meaning more than once and in more than one direction. One important reason why democracy is very controversial to define is that it has become very fashionable for different types of governments to lay claim to being democratic. We will therefore attempt to clarify the meaning of the term in this section. A useful way of clarifying the concept of democracy is to realize that it is used to refer both to a system of government and to a set of principles. As a system of government, democracy simply means rule by the people or their elected representatives. When people rule themselves directly, we talk of direct democracy. When people are ruled by their elected representatives, we talk of indirect democracy. There are some other senses in which democracy can be understood as a system of government which we shall discuss in subsequent sections. Democracy can also be viewed as a set of principles or ideas, as earlier noted. The most important principle associated with democracy is the idea that political power originates from the people and that government is therefore legal or legitimate only when it is based on the consent of the people. You will immediately notice the close connection between democracy as a set of ideas and democracy as a system of government. For it is precisely because of the idea that power belongs to the people that a democratic system of government either takes the form of direct democracy, in which people rule themselves directly, or indirectly when people are ruled by those they themselves have elected. We shall discuss in greater details the ideas and principles associated with democracy in section 2.4. Look for as many dictionaries and introductory texts on government and politics as you can find and write down the definition of democracy in each of them. See whether there are any contradictions in all the definitions of democracy that you have been able to find, including the one provided in this section. After that, you can write down your own preferred definition of democracy. The development of democracy. Democracy developed first among the ancient Greeks. Indeed, the word democracy has its roots in 2 Greek words, demos, meaning the people, and kraton, meaning to rule. Thus, democracy in ancient Greece was understood as direct democracy, that is, rule by the people of the whole body of citizens. Ancient Athens was the Greek city-state in which direct democracy flourished the most. In the 4th century BC, Athens had a population of some 40,000 citizens, and meetings or assemblies were usually held when important decisions were to be taken. However, less than 10% of Athenians actually attended or participated in these meetings. The type of town meeting democracy associated with Athens, however, had to be abandoned as societies became larger and people lost the opportunity for face-to-face interaction. The best that can be done under these modern circumstances is for all citizens to participate in government through their elected representatives. Modern democracy is therefore a government of elected representatives. That is, it is based on representation rather than the direct participation. The history of the development of modern democracy is a very complex one. After the fall of the Greek city-states, it was not until the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789 that representative democracy fully came alive. The American Revolution, for instance, saw the beginning of a series of political reforms which led to the introduction of universal male suffrage, that is, the right of all men to vote, in 1845. 5 years later, in 1850, women's suffrage was introduced in America. Also, the French Revolution of 1789 proclaimed the right of the people to choose those who will rule them, and since that revolution, elections and even plebiscites based on universal suffrage has become a familiar feature of French life. For a very long time, Britain practiced a system of representative democracy in which only a few, namely those who had enough property or wealth, were allowed to participate in electing the increasingly powerful parliament. In 1918, however, Britain recognized the right of all adult males to vote. 10 years later, in 1928, full women's suffrage was introduced. Other countries in Europe, Asia, and the Americas soon followed the example of America, France, and Britain, so that by the end of the Second World War in 1945, virtually all independent countries of the world proclaimed their commitment to one form of representative democracy or the other. When the colonies in Asia and Africa also gained independence from alien rule, they adopted democratic forms of government, although in many cases, democracy eventually gave way to military rule and one-party dictatorship. Now, look for as many dictionaries and introductory texts on government and politics as you can find, and write down the definition of democracy in each of them. See whether there are any contradictions in all the definitions of democracy you have been able to find, including the one provided in this section. Post your own preferred definition of democracy on Course Forum at UI Mobile Class. Your definition should not be more than a paragraph or 80 words. Varieties of democracy. In the last session, we spoke of two broad types of democratic government, namely direct democracy and indirect democracy. In this session, we shall not only examine the essential features of direct and indirect democracy, but we shall also discuss two other subtypes of democracy, namely liberal democracy and social democracy. Direct democracy. This is the original meaning of democracy as a system of government. Under direct democracy, the right to make political decisions is exercised directly by the whole body of citizens acting under procedures of majority rule. Thus, the essential characteristics of direct democracy is the direct participation of citizens, or a majority of them, in government. As we noted earlier, Greek democracy, as practiced in the small Greek city-state of Athens during the 4th century BC, was the closest approximation to direct democracy. Representative democracy. This is also known as modern or indirect democracy. It is a form of democratic government where citizens exercise their right to take part in the affairs of government through representatives chosen and responsible to them. As we observed while discussing the historical development of democracy in the last section, modern societies are very large ones, and the greater number of people involved, the less meaningful and possible their direct participation in government. Thus, modern democracy, unlike direct democracy, is based on representation rather than participation of the people in government. The people who are governed are not the same people who govern. Instead of the people directly making laws or policies themselves, they elect representatives or legislators to do so for them. An important feature of representative democracy is therefore the right of the people to elect those who will govern them and the regular conduct of such elections. Liberal or constitutional democracy. Democracy is also understood, particularly in countries of North America and Western Europe, to mean a form of government, usually a representative democracy, where the powers of government are exercised within a framework of constitutional restraints. These constitutional restraints or checks are designed to protect certain political rights of citizens, such as the freedom of speech, religion, and association, from arbitrary interference by the government. Thus, in a liberal democracy, there are limits on what the government may do, and the government does not control or even largely influence such institutions as the mass media, religious groups, and pressure groups. In short, the liberal democratic government operates at the margin of social activity. Social democracy. This is a form of government which, regardless of whether or not it is democratic in any of the three senses mentioned above, tends to minimize social and economic differences among citizens. This type of democratic government has had the greatest influence in Russia and the other socialist countries of Western Europe. Usually, a government of social democracy would intervene actively in the economy, or even assume direct control of it in order to ensure that resources are evenly distributed among various groups in society, and that citizens are provided with basic needs such as employment, education, electricity, water supply, housing, and more. Social democracy is based on the principle that the right of the people to elect those who will govern them will be meaningless unless it is accompanied by the rights of citizens to have a fair access to the economic resources of society. There are four varieties of democratic government, namely direct, indirect, liberal, and social democracy. What are the differences and similarities among these varieties of government? What would you consider to be the relative advantages and disadvantages of direct and indirect democracy? Write down your own answers clearly and concisely. You may also see political ideologies on pages 104 to 107 by Leo P. Baradat and Rudi and others. Introduction to Political Science, pages 35 to 36 for further notes. Principles of democracy. Democracy, as we have observed, is more than a method of government. It also embodies a set of ideas or principles. Some of the principles or ideas of democracy are: political power comes from the people and government. It is therefore legal or legitimate only by the consent of the governed. In order to justify this principle of popular sovereignty, early democratic theorists argue that in the past, people had come together and agreed to establish a government to regulate their common affairs and enhance their collective security. This agreement was called the social contract, and it was regarded as a source of the authority of the government. Social contract is the belief that government should be a contract between the people and the governing body. Another principle of democracy is the belief that the individual is of major value or importance in society, and that he has some rights that are inalienable and fundamental, or that cannot be taken away without the due process of the law. The right to life, freedom of association, and speech are commonly regarded as the most important of these rights. Other democratic rights include the right to property, employment, and financial support in old age, education, and other socioeconomic benefits. Rights is a power or privilege possessed by a particular person by virtue of law. Each right that an individual possesses usually relates to a corresponding legal duty imposed on another. For example, when a person owns a home or property, he has the right to possess and enjoy it free from the interference of others, who are under a corresponding duty not to interfere with the owner's rights. Another principle of democracy is the idea that each individual is basically equal to all other individuals, and therefore that no human being is more human than the other. However, the precise meaning of this equality is uncertain. While some Democrats argue that people are equal in all ways, others argue that while people have the same fundamental human rights, they differ widely in such qualities as intelligence and business ingenuity. Lastly, all Democrats share the idea that men are basically rational and that they should therefore be given a role in the activities of government or in the process of electing or choosing the government. In this study session, we have tried to clarify the meaning of democracy as well as trace its historical development. Although democracy is a very controversial term, it can adequately be understood as a method of government and a set of ideas or principles. Historically, democracy first developed in ancient Greece, where it took the form of direct or town meeting democracy. But modern democracy developed in America, France, and Britain, and as it is widely practiced today, it is the indirect or representative type of democracy in which people participate by electing representatives to do so for them. A democratic system of government can take the form of any one or more of the following varieties of democracy, such as direct democracy, indirect or representative democracy, liberal democracy, and social democracy. Direct democracy is based on the direct participation of the people in government and is hardly possible in modern times. Most democratic systems of the world today take the form of representative democracy. Liberal democratic regimes are those operating within restraints imposed by the constitutional guarantee of certain rights to citizens and are common in countries of North America and Western Europe. Social democratic governments seek to meet the economic needs of the majority of citizens and are usually to be found among the socialist countries of Eastern Europe, including Russia. As a system of ideas, democracy embodies principles that emphasize popular sovereignty, human rights, human equality, and human rationality. Now that you have completed this study session, you can assess how well you have achieved its learning outcomes by answering these questions. Write your answers in your study diary and discuss them with your tutor at the next study support online meeting. You can check your answers with the feedbacks on the self-assessment questions at the end of this manual. Thank you for listening.